The haves and the have-nots, how will they be divided? What's the criteria? Will it happen? We talk all of that. We got Bill Bender here from Sporting News. We appreciate Bill stopping by to break down some college football for us. And Bill provided us with an article just here the last week or so on a breakdown that is feasible, that certainly could happen. I don't believe, and we will find out more from Bill, whether he's predicting it or not. No, just one way to look at things, and we will put the link of that article at Sporting News down in the description section below. Bill, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on. I've listened to the show and, like I said, bumped into you at Big Ten Media Day, and we haven't had a chance to talk. So I'm really excited, a little bit nervous, honestly, but we'll have some fun here.
Appreciate you being here. This is great stuff. And I got to say, this predates you, but probably carries into your tenure as well. The Sporting News, it used to be called the Sports Bible. And absolutely, in my household, for me, oh my goodness, when it came to finding out the latest NFL team reports and baseball statistics and just everything, it was cutting edge, no question about that. So before we get started, Bill, very quickly, just about your journey journalistically and getting to Sporting News.
Yeah, I'm an Ohio kid, raised in Big Ten country from Lancaster, Ohio, went to Ohio University and, had a lot of fun down there. I'm not going to lie. That was good, but also a really good, proud journalism school. So, bumped around a couple newspapers in Ohio and then went to Sporting News. I've been there for 15 years, been covering college football for a little more than 10. Good people. Like you said, we get the magazine end of it a lot, but we're still in that space. We have great writers, great people like Mike DeCourcy and others. I love working there. I always compare us a little bit to kind of like the Tigers or the Pirates, classic franchise that when they're good, and I believe we're good most of the time, they're fun to root for. So maybe we're better than the Pirates because I know the Pirates struggle a little bit to get in the postseason.
Well, I'll say this, Bill, probably predates you just a few years, not many, maybe a few years. I was making that decision between Kent State and Ohio University. I chose to stick closer to home and went to Kent.
Well, my wife went there, so we have fun with that. So not to get too far off track here, but my senior year was the year Kent made the Elite Eight run. And with Huffman and Gates. So I was fortunate enough to cover those teams. And I still contend that was one of the best crafted starting fives that you could possibly have for a tournament run between Gates and Huffman and Shaw, Andrew Mitchell. And I believe they had a 7-footer named Edwards. That was the perfect max sleeper team. And they were a lot of fun to cover. So that's that. If that dates me a little bit, that's fine. That was a fun team to cover.
I remember it well. Absolutely. All right, let's get into the college football landscape that's ever changing. And so much talk about, well, there are schools out there that don't bring the value necessary at this day and age to the networks required, and that there's going to be constriction of what's the standard and the quality of college football, and it's going to be sized down. 40 is a number that's thrown out. I know it's a number that you worked with, and you broke down a model that involves revenue. It involves winning percentage, national championships, NFL draft status, and then the APR. I love that you brought actually academics into this. They're actually still student athletes technically. And regardless of what a lot of people think, many of them still approach it that way. So I was glad to hear that was a component as well.
That was probably the one that got the most pushback. And, one of the things I heard was, you don't hear schools bragging about their APR, but if we don't have some sort of academic component to this hypothetical super league, for example, then we're not playing college football anymore. And some would say we're already there, and that's fine. But as we enter the NIL space and the revenue sharing space, I think, to me, it's balancing. Okay, what does your program brag about, right? You still have fans that brag about academics. That's fine. You want to have that marriage of I produce guys that go to the NFL. I win on the field while I'm there. And yeah, we graduate our guys. So how else would you sell a recruit if you're walking into their living room? And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. Not a perfect model, not because I think you and I would agree that if they ever do a super league, it's going to be based on which schools produce the most money, revenue. And that'd probably be number 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of categories. But the school, I had fun working the formula, sticking to the model. And I didn't think there were a ton of surprises other than maybe like Boise State and Air Force in this league.
Anytime you put together a model, Bill, and we just did a series that concluded last week where we looked at all-time program rankings, and it wasn't just something where I threw out one number, national championships. No, I had like 20 criteria. Like I was an exhaustive type look that it's becomes unwielding to a certain extent. You can't be perfect. You know, you're evaluating for uh, and I looked through your article, you mentioned some recently elevated group of fives and then some others that are still in the group of five, and their winning percentage is obviously bolstered by that. So it can't be perfect in any kind of metric or measurement.
No, it really is one of those things that I think it's not perfect. One of the things with the revenue that wasn't perfect too is there's 16 schools that don't disclose revenue to USA Today. So in reality, Stanford and Boston College are probably in this Super League, but they take a 0 in that category because we don't know their numbers. Notre Dame and USC would be ranked significantly higher based on the revenue that I'm sure those programs bring in. Winning percentage isn't perfect because obviously Boise State's playing in the Mountain West Conference versus Indiana playing in the Big Ten. Though I would contend for people that push back against the Boise State being in a league like this, they've been pretty relevant in the 21st century. They've been close to the national championship game in the BCS era. They've won consistently, and they're in a region of the country where I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like they're almost maxed out in terms of what they can do. I mean, everybody in Idaho, I'm sure, roots for Boise State that's going to root for them. So I respect that, and I respect Air Force. They win their football games and they graduate players. Are they a top 40 revenue brand? Probably not, obviously, but I still like what they do there.
The military academies have my respect to the hilt.
Yes.
To just think that there are guys that can go out there on Saturday after taking on everything that they do from an academic and military standpoint and just think that this is maybe their fourth or fifth priority on their list and they're still able to compete against some of the better teams in the nation is rather exemplary in my book. And you bring up Boise State when given the opportunity. Maybe not so much in recent years. They've been more competitive against power conference teams where they used to defeat those conference teams, 15 or 20 years ago. And there's always going to be the argument, well, if they had to go through a gauntlet, they wouldn't be able to be as successful. But I got to think that they are and have been better than at least a third to a half of the Power Five over the last 15 to 20 years.
Right. Well, and to me, it's not even about, we can get into the schools on the cut line, but to me, the genesis of this really relies on the big brands, the Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, Alabama, the inevitability of this. And I know Greg Sankey swatted away talk about it last week, but it still feels inevitable to me. I always use this example from last year. I obviously live in Central Ohio, bunch of friends that root for Ohio State. I'm sitting there last fall working, and one of my buddies, he's a diehard Buckeye fan. I mean, as diehard as can be. He texted me and he said, I can't watch this Minnesota game. It's unwatchable for me because he goes, I want some competition. And I'm not picking on Minnesota here. I could have said the same about a Michigan State or Nebraska, Michigan, Nebraska, you could have said the same thing, where there are a lot of schools that aren't competitive with them. And I don't know if this would level the playing field, but I do know that Ohio State, maybe they're an exceptional case, but I do know under Ryan Day, they've only lost 3 Big Ten games, and that's to one school. And everybody knows who that school is. Everybody else they play, I've been in the press box for some of those where it's like, well, this game's over in the first quarter.
Yeah, to your point, the last time they lost a Big Ten game would be when, other than Michigan, yes, that team would be the West Lafayette debacle under Urban Meyer in 2018. So you got to go back to a previous coach. You got to go back to Urban Meyer before they lost to anybody else in the league. Yeah, it's crazy. The disparity in college football, of course, is unlike any other sport that we know of in pro or college. And I don't know, with all the money that the Indianas and Rutgers and the Big Ten schools that have been bottom feeders will be bringing in with this new contract, whether they will make good use of that money to be competitive.
Right. And where is that revenue going to go? I mean, obviously, the priority at Purdue and Indiana is probably basketball. They put money into that Purdue basketball machine. And Indiana, that's I guess an entirely different podcast topic, which school or which sport they're better at right now. But yeah, I mean, so to me, Michigan and USC and Washington and Oregon, those aren't surprises that they would make the cut in this. Michigan State, even, I think we would all agree that in a top 40 scenario, Michigan State would be there, Iowa would be there. And, they had 11 schools that made the cut. The big omission, the most jarring school that didn't make it for me was Nebraska. But then I really thought about it and I said, yeah, they'll bring in revenue. They haven't been successful in the 21st century. It's been a long time. I mean, I mentioned Ohio University. Frank Solich was probably the last coach where they were truly national championship contender worthy. I mean, they did get to one and it didn't go well with Miami, but they would be the one school that when I looked at this at the end, I was like, oh, wow, they're not in. Pitt would be the other, where you're like, I thought Pitt would have been ranked a little bit higher on that list.
Yeah, Nebraska, again, we did all-time program rankings, but also broke it down CFP era, 21st century, and since 1970. Nebraska is 15 games under 500 during the college football playoff era.
Wow.
That's with a lot of FCS and Group of 5 games mixed in. So it's been a down time for Nebraska football. So I talk to fans all the time that desire this type situation. They're sick of that fill in the blank Minnesota game or whomever against their powerhouse favorite team. Whereas I just do not want to see the Wake Forest and the Boston Colleges of the world go away. I just like the inclusion. I like the fabric of the sport, or what it once was, different regionalities, different music flavors, different tastes of food, all those things that make America what it is from different regions be part of this sport.
Well, I mean, the school that I always think of first is West Virginia. That's who we lose. That's who gets left behind. A unique spot in the country, a unique country roads tradition, awesome uniforms that you don't see in other places, memories of Major Harris and Pat White, and they've been competitive, and that goes away. And there's going to be, if we do go to this model, which I don't necessarily, half of me wants to see it because it's like, yeah, that'd be real to see those games every week. The other half, again, I'm a Mac graduate, so there's always that, Ohio University might get in the playoff now. And, they feel like that at Tulsa and Appalachian State and places like that. To your point, the fabric of this sport has already been torn a little bit, though, because we lost the Pac-12. We lost a region. We're seeing networks take over. Last week I said it's an underrated story, though. I mean, we're moving the Texas-Oklahoma game off noon. That might not mean a lot to like maybe you and me, but I guarantee it means something to Texas and Oklahoma fans because it just shows the power that television and those television slots have over everything else right now.
We are just about an hour removed from having a conversation with an OU insider guy who brought that up. Don't like that. Don't want that. And I had the same response as you just communicated concerning half and half response to the Pac-12 schools moving into the Big Ten. Half of me was, no, I want a Pac-12 to exist. I want regionality. I want what it used to be. But at the same time, does the schedule get a little stale? If you're Iowa and you play the Big Ten Western Division, you always play Iowa State. You never schedule anybody else outside of Iowa State besides an FCS school and a MAC school. Your schedule looks the same. Now, Penn State's going to the Rose Bowl. USC's coming to the Big House. Those types of matchups invigorate me from the standpoint of seeing different teams, different matchups, big game atmospheres more often.
Oh, for sure. I think the Pac-12 West Wing thing is kind of cool. I mean, I'm adjusting to the fact that we're going to have a huge game between Ohio State and Oregon on October 12th. And they may do it again, and they may do it again after that. Now, like I said about some of these things changing within the sport, yeah, I mean, Michigan, Ohio State, the value of that game is going to change. It's still going to be hot, and it's still going to be a 365 days a year rivalry. There's no question. But what if they play again the next week? What if they have to play again 3 weeks later? I mean, at some point it waters down at least a little bit. We all have to admit that. I go back to that Big Ten Media Day you and I were at last year where they were asking Ryan Day that very question. And in the past, you would say Ohio State or a Michigan coach would shut that down pretty quickly. The fact that it opened up into a conversation, and Ryan Day had good points. I mean, they're going to have to talk about it because the way this sport has changed is it about winning your conference or is it about winning the 12-team playoff? I can guarantee you what most coaches are going to answer.
And that's the way most fans are going to answer. We saw a situation like, to your point, where Ohio State and Michigan has been just everything to so many people. And I get this question asked all the time, and I'm sure you do as well. Is Ryan Day going to get fired if they lose to Michigan? Not if he's successful in the playoffs. If they lose to Michigan and go on and play in a national championship, it almost happened 2 years ago in a 4-team playoff. If they make a field goal, they probably are the national champions with a 3-touchdown loss to Michigan on their resume. And to your point, that's more likely to happen going forward.
The sliding definition of success for a season now. Penn State fits right into that wheelhouse where, in past seasons, 10-2, lost to Michigan, Ohio State, didn't make the playoff. In a 12-teamer, they're still in. So they go win a game. You forget about that, maybe that big loss to Ohio State in that instance, and they don't play Michigan this year. Ohio State, I think you just said it. One of the things I'm very curious about is which team is built to win 3 playoff games. I don't know that somebody can win 4 in this setup. I really don't. Those buys are going to be huge. Adam Rittenberg talked to me about that last week on one of their radio shows. He has real concern that there isn't a team that can win 4 games. I'd be in agreement with that. So those buys become really huge. What happens when we have the Jordan Travis injury happen within the playoff, not 2 weeks before the ACC championship? That's going to happen. It happens in the NFL all the time. So Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, they're built to win it today, but a lot can happen from now until, when's the season over? January 20th. They moved it all the way back on us there. That's 10 more days.
No, I completely agree with the 4-game winning streak evaluation of what it's going to take. Look at TCU 2 years ago. I know that they got completely annihilated in that championship game, but they made it to the championship game. Don't think that team gets through, and they would have had to do that as a 4-game situation because they didn't win the Big 12. They'd have to go through 4. That team's not getting anywhere close to that game going into the future. I just don't see it.
No, and you have to have the depth necessary to do that. So that's why the Super League talk to me makes sense on some level, because you're going to have the schools that are truly able to do that. Michigan won 15 games last year. I didn't think that's one thing that happened in the 4-team era that I didn't think would happen as much as it did. Is I didn't think we'd have 15-0 teams. I didn't think Michigan would be able to do that, or LSU would be able to do that, or I think Clemson and Alabama and Georgia all did that. That was a little bit of a surprise. I thought we would have more of the first year of it when Ohio State, they lost one, but they got hot at the right time. So, that remains to be seen. Then I say all this, and then Ole Miss will go out and win the first college football playoff somehow. They'll get hot, and Jackson Dart will hold up the trophy, and Kiffin will do that. And I'll say, well, I was completely wrong. But it is a lot of games. It's a lot of bodies. That's why I think the roster talk at SEC meetings last week was such a hot topic, because you need the walk-ons. You need those extra bodies because you don't have a free agent waiver wire like the NFL does.
There's a bit of a quirk in this system of 12 teams with the 4 buys, where, of course, if what we see going forward is what most of us anticipate, is that it's a Big Ten SEC dominated situation, but the final 2 buys go to, of course, the conference champions in the ACC and the Big 12. You could see the 9th ranked team in the country and the 13th ranked team in the country receive buys. And if you lay out the model, which I'm guessing you have at some point, I have looked at past seasons and to see how it would play out, you could have the second best team possibly in the country, probably a top 3 or 4 team from the SEC or the Big Ten, be the 5 seed, in certain circumstances, maybe even miss a conference championship game, play the Liberty of that season as the 12 seed and have kind of a cushy entry into the second round.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like Notre Dame, for example, I know they can't get a first round bye. I think those matchups are going to be everything. What are we going to do with that 6-11 matchup that is, if I was going off our preseason top 25, for example, you would have like a Michigan, Alabama 8-9 game. That'd be tough versus, like you said, whatever group of 5 school gets in. Memphis is going to be a hot pick this year. So do you get Memphis versus Florida State in the first round? I don't want you just said it. You're not looking at it like a bye, but yeah, you want that matchup so you can get into the second round and then go from there. And having the home campus game, I'm very curious to see how that plays out. I'm really excited about it. I think the weather part's being overplayed a little bit. You got to go play. NFL teams go play. I've seen, and I'm a Packers fan, and I've watched San Francisco go into Lambeau Field one too many times in recent years and go ahead and go win that game. So the better team generally wins. But I do think the on-campus element I'm really excited about. This, but I don't understand why the teams that get the top 4 spots, why we're not giving them one game on campus. I do understand the why. I just wish that we would.
It's kind of funny that some of the greatest clutch NFL players in the cold were warm weather collegiates, and Brett Favre, Bart Starr, Tom Brady grew up in California. Yeah, people adjust. They're football players. They should be able to adjust. But it will be, I can't wait to see games at wherever they end up in terms of a location. But yes, give me Camp Randall in mid-December. That would be fun to see.
Oh, for sure. And I think we'll get those games. We'll get the LSU at Wisconsin. We'll get somebody at Boise State, an SEC school, and that'll be the best moment in that school's life. And that's what I keep saying with it, again, spinning that back to the MAC schools. And Western Michigan had that moment where they had the perfect season. They lost in the Cotton Bowl to Wisconsin, but they played well. I think getting that game is going to be so important. And I'm still under the illusion that, maybe one day Ohio University can get to the playoff and go beat a Tennessee in the first round. And you know what? That will feel like how it felt when they played in the Sweet 16 against North Carolina on the men's basketball side.
That's right.
Down the road, will the group of 5 maybe be pressed into doing their own thing? Maybe, because I just think it's harder for those schools. There are upsets, but I think it's just harder with the portal and the NIL and the revenue and all the things that they're going to struggle to keep up with. I think in future seasons, it's going to be even harder for the group of 5 to keep up with these mega brands in the FBS.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to take 5 years, 10 years, at what point that's going to be, but it's going to be exciting when we see OU, meaning Ohio U's, leading Clemson 24-20 in the fourth quarter, and people are freaking out and can't believe it. And
oh, it'd be awesome. I would be really excited. But, there are gaps within the gaps, though. There are gaps between the group of 5 and the Power 5. There are Power 4. I got to say that now. And there are gaps within the Big Ten and within the SEC. And I'm anxious to see. One of the things I was told by Jim Cavale, he works for athletes.org, this House versus NCAA settlement and the $22 million and the who's going to be able to supplement the NIL on top of that while funding all their other athletic programs. We're going to find out who the haves and have-nots really are and where they kind of fall. And then you can get serious about it. All right, do we need to do a super league because are these gaps too wide?
My other thought there, Bill, is that there is revenue distribution that's equal among, regardless of the performance of these schools and how much they put into it, that Ohio State, Michigan, why would they not go to the Big Ten at some point and say, we're competing for the same players and having to pay out this 20 to 25 million to fund a roster against Indiana and Rutgers, but we're bringing in an astronomical times quantity past what the revenue of these other schools are bringing in. We need unequal revenue distribution coming our way.
Well, they're already doing that in the ACC, right? With Florida State and Clemson. You raise a great point. I mean, I would be curious to hear what your thoughts on the relegation side is. I've heard, well, if we do this Super League, we're going to boot this team out or boot this team out. And there's Big Ten schools that I bet remember Gene Smith's comments a few years ago about schools pulling their weight. He used that phrase. I don't know. Some took it as like a jab at Michigan when USC was brought in. I didn't see it that way. I just saw it as kind of a warning shot to the lower end schools. We know Michigan, Penn State, and USC and Oregon and Ohio State are going to draw eyeballs. It's that middle to bottom tier. It's like, okay, what do you offer to this conference is we're going to pull in all this TV money, because I think Ohio State, Michigan, I would rope Penn State in there too. I think they draw enough that they could start asking that question very loudly.
I think probably the most fair model is to say we take roughly 50% of the league revenue and we distribute it evenly, because you're all members. We want to value that. There's that portion of it. Then we're going to take the other 50%. We're going to tie it to some formula that involves TV ratings, popularity, and what each school is bringing in, and distribute it other differently, kind of like a luxury tax in Major League Baseball.
Yeah. And I could see that happening as well. That's the big thing in the ACC. Once they figure that out, maybe that conference can be saved. And I've been pretty on the record and adamant about this. I don't want to see the ACC go. Why would you want to see another region of the country get split up into, while the thought of a Big Ten that adds Florida State, Miami, Notre Dame, and North Carolina on one end is kind of fun to think about. On the other, I wasn't happy when the Pac-12 died.
Yeah.
Because I just don't think it's good for the overall health of a sport that we both agree, I think, that regionalism's okay. You can make it a national sport, but it's the regionalism that ties it together. Those same buddies I was talking to you about, Ohio State and Minnesota, I don't know how excited they are to see, well, if it was, Washington and Minnesota play late at night, or Washington and Iowa play late at night. And I'm not giving those programs strays. I'm just saying there are matchups within let's do it even better. Maryland versus UCLA. My buddies aren't staying up late for that one.
The relegation I do not want to see, and it's easy to discard Indiana and Rutgers and Vanderbilt in football, and they have been awful. And again, I'll preface and refer to the program rankings we did all time. Indiana's got the worst percentage in the history of the sport,
right,
at 418, and Wake Forest is right there at 420. They've been awful for when you finish ranked 3 times in your history, ranked,
right.
Like we're talking like 24th in the country. Nothing. That great. You really have not been serious about the sport, but still, when you figure Ohio State entered the Big Ten in 1912 and there were already 9 members, that's a lot of history to discard. Schools that have been in the Big Ten pre-1900 and you're going to kick them out. Right. I don't like to see that.
I don't think it will. And I wrote a story last year at the height of the realignment. And you're going to have to send me your program rankings. I definitely want to check that out and kind of compare it to what we did with this Super League, just because I want to kind of cross check which ones made both in the spots. But anyway, 1984, I looked at an article. I said, what college football looked at in 1984, compared it to 2024, and kind of went like a conference by conference look. And I'm wondering how many college football fans would take the old model. Not maybe with the playoff, though, because I said, there's plenty of people that might in Texas that might look back at the Southwest Conference and be like, I like that. There's Big Ten fans that would be like, the 10-team Big Ten was in 1984. Take that. You're playing Illinois and Iowa every year. I would, as somebody that's followed the Big Ten my entire life, I would say I would take the 11-team model with Penn State on top. I think they've been around. They've added enough to it. The Ohio State, Penn State games, the Penn State, Michigan State rivalries, they feel like a Big Ten team. But there are some that would still say they feel like an outsider. And they've been in the Big Ten for 30 plus years.
Yeah, I think it depends on your age.
Right.
Certainly we anticipated Penn State. They've been good in the Big Ten, but they've not won championships in the Big Ten. But they have certainly added, value, prestige, popularity to a league that was dominated by Ohio State and Michigan. Although you look at the 1980s, it's funny now to think of Illinois winning Big Ten championships, Michigan State winning Big Ten championships in the 80s, and Iowa competing on a regular basis for the top spot in the Big Ten, something that's not really happening now. So, Bill, before we let you go, we want to remind everyone that the link to Bill's article on the Super League is down in the description section right below the video, and you can catch all of his work. You see the X handle there, both at Sporting News and with Bill. That getting outside of this exact conversation, heading into 2024, anything under the radar for most people that you think is going to be very intriguing, whether it's a matchup or a position group or a particular under the radar team or anything out there that is intrigues you right now?
The 2-minute warning coming to the sport, and does that change the another change within the game? Like when they started running the clock last year, outside of 2 minutes, I was a fan of that because I think the college, and it's not the college football game, it's the commercials that have gotten in the way. You know, I have kids, and I've said this for years that the attention span of that generation, they're not going to be sitting around watching 4-hour football games. So we've got to do something to shorten that game time a little bit. I think that helps. But what does the 2-minute warning add? Are we going to have strange and fantastic finishes that are, you know, make this game so special? You know, the 29-point comeback in the second half, is that possible now because of the clock running? And I want to see things like that, how that changes within the game. There are so many things that are going to be bizarre for us this year with the teams and the conferences. And I mean, the one that you mentioned, the team, the one that's going to stand out to me most is SMU in the ACC. Like Stanford and Cal in the ACC, like you're going to double take sometimes where you're like, wait, this is a conference game? What? And I think just being ready for all of that, there's going to be so much different about the sport this year in terms of that on the field, off the field, and the video game, which I think is going to contribute to that younger generation. I played a lot of the old video game, by the way. So I'm looking forward to, might have to come out of retirement for that one.
Absolutely. It's funny because maybe 2 months ago, I was asked by a publication to put together an all ACC team, and I did a lot of exhaustive research on it. And I got about, a third into it. And I got a SMU, Stanford, Cal,
Yeah.
bring them into this.
Yeah.
I forgot. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of changes, but I'm looking forward to it. And I'm hoping, you mentioned that word fabric, and I'm hoping we still have some within the sport, that it isn't just about the money, the TV, the playoff, that we can still have those moments that make it special across 134 FBS campuses. I'm trying to sound like the next college football commissioner here, but it's definitely a sport I love and can't wait to cover another season.
Because to sound to your earlier point, if not, then if you're just watching the best product on the field, then watch the NFL. If there's not going to be much separation, I don't know why anyone would want to watch college football.
Right. I mean, if you go back and look at the 70s, and everybody says, well, the 70s or the 80s, or these were great eras. I mean, I've seen game logs of a Woody Hayes season and what they did to Purdue and what they did to Illinois and what, those Bo Schembechler teams used to do until they got to it's not like that hasn't changed that much. I do think the 12-team playoff will offer more chances for more teams to maybe make that run and become more visible. But at the end of the year this year, I think you're still looking at Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, maybe Oregon.
Certainly looks like it. Bill Bender, Sporting News. Bill, it was a great conversation. Appreciate you stopping by, sir.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me on.